Okay, everybody, welcome to this webinar, which is going to be focused on who wants to be a startup. Thank you very much for spending some time with us today, and we are incredibly excited. If you've got any questions, we can sort of follow up with them. Please do feel free to add them into the chat box as well. And also don't forget to connect with us. We are out there, so we've got our Twitter links, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. We've even got a new YouTube channel, Sally, so there we go, we're moving ahead. So please do connect with us on any one of those streams. Now, the thing we're going to focus on today, it's a really short half an hour, which is probably not enough time to talk about this amazing subject that we're going to look at today with Sally, but it's effectively a session to really look at the differences between startup companies and also those businesses that are already up and running their global businesses, and look at the nuances between those. So we're really excited to have our HR guru. What would you describe? Would you describe yourself as a HR guru? What kind of guru would you describe yourself as, Sally?
Not a guru at all, Ed. Thank you for having me, but yeah, hopefully won't disappoint, but I wouldn't put myself down as a guru at all.
There we
Somebody
go.
who talks pragmatic sense, maybe.
There we go. So Sally has spent sort of over 10 years working with leading hedge fund backed utilities, technology, manufacturing, financial services organizations. So a sort of a complete plethora of different organizations and businesses. And in line with sort of running those HR functions, communications facilities, Sally's also been developing her own passion, which I have to say, I think is a newfound passion of mine, which is around behavioural science. And then through a leadership postgraduate degree in executive coaching, and has, like myself, also done a sort of psychometric certification as well, so we're like-minded on that. But it's incredible actually reading around the behavioural science, just the amount of insight you can get from it. So Sally now runs her own consultancy, TWYO, and add a .com on the end of that, so twyoconsulting.com. Works with a range of companies. I know that from events like this, she's also being picked up for further consultancy work. So do reach out to Sally after this webinar if you're interested in speaking to her about any of the topics or other topics related to today's webinar. But we're very, very pleased to have her with us. And really what we want to focus on is why behavioural science. So I think the big thing that struck me when I was doing my research for this is the fact that obviously, despite all the technology, business is run by humans. So it's done by humans, all for human customers. So understanding how humans or how human beings think and what makes them tick is massively helpful. I know for me, and it's probably one of the dialogues that's a constant through every single day, is why someone's reacting a certain way or thinking in a certain way. So one of the key things around that is the irrational ways maybe we operate, and those aspects are often not appreciated. They're just sort of coined as frustrations. So whilst I think in the last few decades there's sort of been a lapse with that psychology, I think now we're starting to see a real rise in the sort of aspect around behavioural science, which is why we're focused on it today. So the key things we're going to look at today, hopefully, is look at decision making, so taking out hidden bias, implementing change, motivating the workforce. That's a key one, I think, for everyone. What's the sort of hidden ingredients there? So I think just sort of initially, we'll focus on I suppose some of the key facts. I've flipped up one here, which is we only get 2 good hours from our brains a day. So an interesting statistic. When we're giving feedback, 52% of that feedback has a positive effect, which sort of begs the difference around the studies that have done. 33% of it has a negative effect, and 15% no impact whatsoever. And I think lots of people like to give advice constantly. And then the other aspect, which is really interesting, is also looking at kind of the job aspect. So 60% would take a job even if it paid half of a job that they hated. So some really interesting areas around that. So Sally, I'm going to pose the first question to you. And it's a nice easy one to get started. What makes high performance individuals and teams?
Ed, you can't tell everybody it's an easy question to answer, then nobody would pay me for anything. I'm really interested in what you have to say around sort of the 2 hours of real thinking, innovative thinking, sort of every day. And actually, the one thing to bear in mind about that is actually those 2 hours happen for different people at different times of the day. There's a lot of conversations at the moment about, do people come back into work? Do they come into an office? Do we have flexible hours? Do we approach the whole work thing a little bit differently? Everybody responds with those kind of 2 hours, 2 or so hours where they have really, really innovative thinking at different times of the day. People's lifestyles have changed quite significantly. So coming back to your question around high performing individuals, it's really enabling individuals or listening to individuals and understanding from a lifestyle perspective these days, when is good for them. If you can enable that, then, you know, when people have perhaps picked up the children from school or put them to bed, then have those few hours of really focused attention. If you are able to provide people with that time, it's an absolutely wonderful thing to be able to do. And that's what enables sort of individuality, really. From an organizational perspective, a common purpose. You know, why are we going into work? There is the individual. We've got to go into work. We want to be developed. We want to be wanted. It's human nature. We want that sense of belonging. Conversely, what's the organization's purpose? What's its mission? What is it looking to create? You know, and that might be anything from purely generating revenue, volume of product sales. It could be a mission-driven philanthropy, but actually what's the purpose that everybody is working towards? And does everybody align to that purpose? I think if you have that, everybody has that sense of sort of belonging and ownership. I think it's really important. And with that comes the sort of celebrated successes and failures. So take away the sort of the blame. What are the successes? Let's celebrate them. When it goes well, we're all rewarded with perhaps a collective increase or a collective bonus if it's financial, or a meal out, or whatever it might be. But everybody signs up to the successes for that purpose. Conversely, when it goes wrong, everybody gets it wrong. And it's not the getting it wrong, it's the sort of what you do about it. So common purpose is really important. And then finally, we're talking about startups. Less bureaucracy, less politics. You know, when you think about some of the big, sometimes stodgy organizations, and you look at their policies or their handbooks or their systems, they are a mishmash of systems and policies, pages and pages and pages of bureaucracy that actually doesn't need to be there. The beauty of working in a startup is that you have a chance to reinvent what type of organization you want to be and how you want to treat people. And that comes back to, as I said, the paperwork, the systems, clean systems that really deliver what you need them to deliver. And for whatever it is that's not working, get rid of it. With a startup, you've got a chance to do all of this from fresh. So bureaucracy just ties people up in legalistic behaviors and approaches to organizational culture that really don't need to be there.
Some fascinating points. I'm going to touch on two aspects. The first, you raised sort of people wanting to be listened to, which is completely understandable, and then finding time that works for them. And I think that's a really interesting point, because it at least from my perspective, and I think probably for others, everyone's time poor these days. So in respect to that, how do you find the time, let's say, to kind of, or make sure that you find that time to listen to others? Because I think it's really, if you otherwise you could find yourself just constantly in your spare time going out and reaching out to others. I'm just wondering what a good balance looks like in that respect.
I think we have, there's a couple of old sayings coming up: 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And you know, to kind of paraphrase Stephen Covey as an example, start with the end in mind. What is it that you're looking to achieve here? So I'm working with a wonderful startup at the moment. As you know, Ed, we've talked about sort of bringing in some talent to that startup organization. And I'll give you an example. We have a couple of people in the States who are super excited. They're expecting babies in the new year, which is absolutely wonderful. Now, anybody who knows anything about employment law in the States know that if you don't have a year's service and you don't have more than 50 employees, maternity pay and maternity leave are pretty much non-existent. So we have an opportunity to make our own rules around this. And this was a decision that the entire leadership team got involved with and listened to the scenarios, understood the complexities or lack of relating to the law, and then said, well, actually, how do we want to treat our people? And how do they want to be treated, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in? The biggest thing that they did was to go and talk to the individuals themselves and say, this is the situation. These are the basic standards around maternity leave, maternity pay. This is worst case scenario. What would you like it to look like? What would you like your leave and pay and your experience to look like? Because we want you to come back afterwards. And in whatever way, shape or form that might suit you, having, you know, gone off and had babies and brought some new children into the world. So the listening is really important if you're starting with the end in mind. If you really want to engage, to retain, then you'll go and communicate and ask questions. So that's just an example of it's worth making the time now, because later on it might be too late. Yeah. If you're not accommodating, if you're not understanding exactly what it is your teams want in an organization.
Interesting. And the other bit you touched on, which I sort of wanted to go back to, was celebrating the success, but also recognizing the failures. And that's a really interesting one, because the success is obviously highly motivational. And the failures, I think, like everyone, we want to sort of just move past them quite quickly, but actually there's quite a lot of significance in those failures, i.e. the opportunity to kind of learn, grow, develop, etc. So I'm just wondering how, or is there, maybe there isn't, a way of recognizing those failures without them becoming sort of too demotivational for the team?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you've ever traveled with them, American Airlines. They were the only aviation company through 9/11 to continue making money and to continue being a successful airline. And the CEO at the time, on his wall behind him, had pictures of every single failure that had happened in that organization. And the reason he had photos of them was because every single one of those failures had given that organization an opportunity to sit, to discuss, to establish what had happened and how do they prevent that failure happening again in the future. And that's what was absolutely critical to the leadership team in that organization. And there was obviously something in it, because when everybody else was losing money left, right and center, and obviously nobody wanted to fly, they were the one airline that managed to keep going. So, you know, he made a clear point around sort of celebrating failures, because it gave them an opportunity to see what could go wrong and to put it right, to become even better as a result. So yeah, in turn, those failures are successes. And for me, that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think also the world is so polarized on success only these days, and probably something sort of related to the press, the there's a huge negativity if anyone sort of takes a sort of step out of line, and therefore that gets indoctrinated to how kind of lots of workforces think that actually failure is a really bad thing, and we need to sort of, kind of move past it quickly, or it's going to be demotivational. So yes, I think sort of flipping that on its head and celebrating it is definitely a better way of looking at it. Next question, and this is a really key one, because I think for most people, and this sort of slightly flips back, Sally, to the bit we were just talking about of sort of failures, is I think most people recognize that there's probably some level of change they want to implement into their organization, but they just don't know how to go about it. So how do people implement change to an optimum level through, I suppose, the people and performance piece of their business?
Well, when I'm working with leadership teams, the one approach that I always try and instill in organizations is a coaching leadership style. Because if you can ask phenomenal questions and practice active listening through performance reviews, through daily discussions, through team meetings, you will come up with the best ideas, the best organizational performance that your team, that your business can possibly have. So if you were sort of practicing great sort of coaching questions, as a leadership member, as a manager, you'd be saying, what are you looking to achieve here? What are the outcomes that we might see? What's happened before that worked well? What didn't work so well? What outcome are we looking for? What are you prepared to commit to? And then really truly actively listen to the answers and encourage the rest of the team to do the same. You'll actually find that, again, coming back to the original point that I made around ownership, if you are actively listening and actively supporting individuals to come up with answers, ideas, solutions, you will engender the best performance. There's real commitment, and people aren't often actively listened to. So you talked about, you mentioned this hidden bias, and we all have that. It's within us. It's within our DNA. It's the way in which we are raised. It's the way in which our parents, our culture, our communities raise us. It's there. It's not necessarily saying I have no hidden bias. It's actually recognizing that it's there, and then recognizing there are other ways, other views, other things to try. I don't think you can change your DNA or the way that you've been raised or the views that people have around you. And your views and opinions are absolutely perfectly fine, but be prepared to recognize that they are very, very specific to you personally. And then you're able to take them out of the equation to become that active listener. Oh, I can't hear you, Ed.
I'll just unmute myself. That'll help. I also don't know whether we've been on screen, Sally. So there we go. We've also swung onto the screens. Hopefully that works. In respect of just going about that first part of change, what's a great way to provide a catalyst to that? So so that first initiation of change. So that's something that I know when sort of there's that forum of, okay, there's an opportunity here to do something better going forward. Where do you see that, or sort of have you got effective techniques that you often use to try and sort of provide that catalyst for change?
I always, one of the ways in which I work is as it comes back to sort of the teaching and training a coaching approach. So enabling managers, leaders to really understand what quality coaching is, what high quality questions are, and then active listening. So a lot of the development I do is around, perhaps with teams, silent coaching, which sounds really, really strange, but enabling sort of managers or teams to ask someone, really, really practice really good coaching questions, but not have to hear the answer. And that's really one of the ways which people find really strange, but incredibly liberating, to be asked the most wonderful coaching questions and to think through your own answers, your own thoughts in your mind without actually having to share them. is pretty powerful and very liberating. And it's only when people have been the recipients of great coaching do they then really understand quite how thought-provoking it is and it can be. So I always will focus on, you know, what does coaching leadership look like?
Sally, I'm gonna put you on the spot slightly. Your best coaching questions. What are great coaching questions that you use? The ones the go-tos that you use.
Okay, so I would generally always start a coaching session with, what would you like to talk about today? And then just listen. And quite often what people will do is talk about, or is respond with what's at the forefront of their mind. And the more sort of relaxed, the more silent, the more attention you give the individual, the chances are you'll get to what they really want to talk about, or what's really on their mind, after a few moments of that response. So, for example, let's take something pretty straightforward, sort of outside of the sort of the leadership piece. I want to lose weight. And then people will go on to talk about why they want to lose weight and what the impacts will be, the positive impacts will be if they do lose the weight, or if they don't lose the weight, and their health issues, and. So you actually get to the nub of what's really the driving force behind this desire for change, or what it is that they want to talk about, or what they're really thinking about, but haven't yet really articulated to themselves.
Yeah.
So what would you like to talk about today would always be one of my intros. And I guess another one would be, and your sister is very good at this, Ed, so Lucy's fantastic at this too, is the what else? It's the listening. There's a great coach in the US, actually, a lady called Nancy Klein. She wrote a book years ago called Time to Think.
Yeah.
And I was actually trained by her in some of my sessions years ago. And she actually coaches by saying very little at all, because she actually thinks it's incredibly intrusive to impinge on somebody's time to think by talking. Yeah. And it's actually really fascinating, quite unnerving at first, but again, incredibly liberating to be coached by somebody who says very little at all. The objective of the coach is to say as little as possible, but to ask the most pertinent questions at the right time. When somebody's in their flow, you just don't want to interrupt them. That's their privilege. It's a privilege being a coach, being able to listen to it.
It's great advice, and interesting enough, I think, for many leaders, it's probably the hardest thing to practice, because again, going back to them often being quite time poor, so they want to get to the root cause of the problem in seconds and get a solution in seconds. So and that unfortunately doesn't exist in sort of human psychology, as you say, as you kind of need to work to that point rather than necessarily just being, yeah, sort of flip it and say what the person needs to do better and then move on. So yeah, no, really interesting.
Absolutely. How many times have you sat with your team, Ed, and sort of posed a question to a solution to an issue or a challenge in the business, and people are talking, and already in the back of your mind you think, but we need to increase revenue, we need to move into that sector, we need to look at those kind of roles. And actually what your mind's doing is thinking through your bias of your responses to the questions that you're asking. A really good coach will have worked for a long time to change that dynamic about, and that bias around what's going on in their head that might be a solution, but because it's not. But we all do it. It's that bias. It's just being conscious of it.
Yeah, I would say guilty as charged on that front, but yeah, I'll get much better at it, Sally, definitely. Next question, and this is probably a key one that I think people would pay you a fortune for, Sally. I don't know if they already do, but what do successful businesses have that unsuccessful businesses lack?
Two A's. This is really straightforward. Agility and adaptability. If you look at the organizations over the last 18 months that have been successful, they were the ones who adapted and moved at speed. There is no doubt about it. And behind that comes a whole plethora of activity, you know, concise and instructive, informative questions and communications. Those people that moved their businesses from, you know, customer facing storefronts as an example, or delivery or manufacturing organizations, to immediately going to online, looking at great systems, implementing great databases that were really simplistic to use. They adapted, they thought it through, they adapted very quickly, they spoke to their staff. The organization changed as a result. There was real customer focus, and they acted with huge amounts of agility. Absolutely huge amounts of agility. That would be the and they just don't conform, and they don't have to conform, you know. And this is where, you know, working in startups or working in organizations where people are unafraid to throw out the craziest ideas, to give it a go, to recognize that failure might be a result, but with it will come the success of something different to try. It's the adaptability and the agility. It's been absolutely critical this last 18 months. And yeah, the organizations that they've not just survived, they've thrived. They're the ones that I am now going and sort of looking at and researching, and, you know, how did they do it? What did they do? How did they go about things differently? The whole sort of change, transformation piece is fascinating.
With an interesting point around that is, if you've got sort of a company deep rooted in a way of doing things, have you been in a situation where you've helped them identify the two A's, or become more aligned with those two A's and saying, well, actually, you know, let's sort of strip this back and allow your mind to think in that way? Because I know that that's often sort of what it's almost, I've seen this before, where people strive towards just a sort of constant, so they know what they get and they deliver upon that. But actually then you remove all of those elements you've just been talking about there. So how you sort of get those types of organizations that are deep rooted, this is the way that we do things, to sort of strip that back and look at it again.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'll always go and look at is the paperwork, the bureaucracy, the reporting that's done in an organization. Who's looking at it? Who's doing it? Who's making decisions as a result of sort of these dozens and dozens of reports that get sent out week on week to employees, or, you know, to boards, or within the leadership team? Who actually reads it? What's more important, the sort of feel of what's going on in the organization versus sort of huge amounts of reporting? The interesting thing to always do is to whip reports, not send them out and then see who says anything. More often than not, people don't actually notice. You've got to go in and you've got to look at the basics. You've got to look at the reporting, the paperwork. You know, what are the real drivers of the change in the business? Usually it's not reports, because they tend to be retrospective and not necessarily looking forward in terms of what should we be doing, what do we think we should be doing. So there's a lot of sort of foundational operational process that I think people get involved with, spend most of their time doing, conform because that's the way it's always been done, rather than just saying, do you know what, let's just stop some stuff for a minute and let's just find out how much time that frees up. And then let's have some really, really great conversations about what next. What do we actually want to be doing? What do we think that end in mind is going to look at? But you need to create that space. And a lot of the time you can create that space by taking away some of the sort of the operational stodge, if you like, that we're just doing because it's kind of always been done, or we think that we should be doing it.
Yeah. Okay. And with your experience being across sort of different organizations, I know that, and from startup to established businesses, it'd be great to know for you, what are some of the sort of exciting things? They didn't need to be specific to startups, but things that you've seen businesses do of late that actually you think others could implement, and are really sort of having impact and causing positive change.
Yeah, absolutely. So well, there's a few things really. So one organization that I was working with really wanted to have a think about coming back from the pandemic, going back into sort of offices. They had offices across the UK. They contracted me in to basically do an organizational analysis of what did people want to do, how did they want to work, what did that mean for the business in terms of logistics, what did that mean in terms of facilities management. I had 4 big locations across the UK in major cities, huge cost, and it was getting that balance between sort of, you know, individuals saying, well, I'd like to go into an office every now and again and see people and be around people, versus, well, hold on a minute, we have 4 big locations here and we're paying for, you know, receptionist staff, security staff, heating, lighting, this, that and the other, and actually posing that question to the individuals themselves. How do you marry up this balance of flexibility versus, you know, the cost of having facilities? Because again, people want that sense of belonging, so they want the office and their colleagues every now and again, just not 5 days a week.
No.
Out. So that was a really innovative organization actually that said, we don't know the answer. Let's go out and pose some questions and find out. And that took a few weeks to do, with a sort of report and decisions and recommendations that culminated in actually huge amounts of savings from not having 4 major city locations and buildings to being able to invest in a far more flexible hybrid approach to working. So the outcomes in for that organization and on that project were fabulous.
Yeah, I'm on a network of about 200 sort of business owners, and interesting enough, that sort of what do we do, return to work type scenario came up, and it was a myriad of sort of extremes, of one end of we are imposing this to the other end of we're trying this. But interesting enough, no one discussed, we've gone back and actually started to kind of ask the question and get some feedback, and then based on that we're starting to work out what we might look to do. So yeah, it's I know it's one that's sort of a constant through most people's brains, as well as, have we got this right? But I think then that goes back to the 2 A's and sort of saying, well, actually it's okay to not have it right now, and we might change it going forward. So that makes sense. Any others that you've seen, Sally? It's an interesting insight.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to work with startups, and as I said, I work with a few because they are so adaptable, they are so agile in terms of anything, their policies, processes, from things like maternity to things like their recruitment processes, new systems, pay and comp policies, you know, and that's always really interesting for organizations who, you know, are getting ready to generate revenue, have this sort of core group of sort of talents. So, you know, what do you pay people? How do you bonus people or reward people when you haven't actually started generating any revenue yet? And sort of what cost do you apply to policies and processes and ways of working? Again, when you don't have that sort of operational foundation and sort of, well, the operating cost model isn't entirely clear because you're in a growth period. And that's always something really interesting to be challenged by the investors. When you go and talk to the board about what do they want to do, how do they want to invest, is that, you know, investment up front for the future, or do they want to wait until revenue is generated, for example, with sort of very, very entrepreneurial founders who want to sort of try different things. So that stuff I find pretty interesting. But just as interesting is the more established organizations where you have a CEO that says it's not working, people aren't innovative, they're not coming up with good challenging thoughts and questions. And actually, once you go in and start talking to them, you kind of realize, again, it's because they've conformed into a sort of a very set way of working that may well be successful, but is not necessarily going to be successful in the longer term. It's successful now. And turning that sort of the big tankers around is always quite interesting too. Just takes a little bit longer.
Yeah. The aspect in that I've seen, when change is obvious and it's very difficult to implement change, it's often because it's met by one or two stubborn individuals who are not willing to accept another view. Any good techniques for stubborn individuals, or how you've helped them get there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have CEOs that will ring me and say, my team aren't performing, they're not doing a great job, they're not challenging, they don't speak out at meetings, and when you go in and talk to everybody, you kind of realize why. If I've got somebody or a leadership team or a management team who are earning a lot of money, having done what they've done, being very successful, and suddenly they're sort of at this impasse where nothing different is happening. But it's only when you go in there and you start doing things like sort of 360 reviews, organizational analysis, and stakeholder reviews. So you go and talk to staff and you get their feedback, you go and talk to suppliers, you go and talk to clients. And that's part of what I do from a stakeholder perspective. So it's not just that CEO or it's not just that leadership team. You've got to hold the mirror up and say, these are people's views and opinions, without naming individuals, in an environment where perhaps there isn't psychological safety, but certainly you've got to find a way of being able to hold up the mirror. And so I always will try and lead off with some work like that. So you can then start to open people's minds as to why they might not be seeing some constructive challenge and assertiveness from employees, really, or their leadership teams or what have you. The answer is usually not too difficult to get to. It's persuading people of what the answer is and then how to change behaviors. But you can get to that point once you've done the analysis and the feedback. You can't ignore the feedback from 10, 20, 30, 150 people. It's there. It's getting to the point where you can hold the mirror up with that feedback. And that soon sort of kicks off any transformation work. So yeah, that's usually my leading approach.
I like it. I mean, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I could literally discuss this for hours, because it's I think it's a daily dialogue in sort of an individual's own mind around sort of the workplace and interactions with colleagues and what they want, and how do you get that successful formula both in a business and from a sort of a type of sort of wellness aspect as well. You talked about recruitment, Sally. We are trying to flip things on its head here at Strive. So if anyone hasn't come across Strive, effectively we are a startup. We're developing what you can see in front of you, which is a hiring product, so an applicant tracking system, which will do so much more than that. So it'll actually track people end to end. So from the top of the funnel, which is hiring, right throughout their employee life cycle. That's what we're building here. And you can see in front of you, a big aspect of it is the element that it's going to save time. So we've got all of these amazing automated flows now that you can pick templates, and it does all the bits for you. So you can act like an amazing, huge organization, even if you're 5 people, 20 people, 100 people. So we're really passionate about that product, and would welcome anyone who wants to reach out and get in touch with us and learn more about what Strive is and how it works. Sally's kindly been helping us out on some of the product development, so no doubt some of the insights that she has have sort of drawn through to the system itself. But Sally, thank you very much for all of your time. Really appreciate it. If anyone does want to reach out to Sally, again, she is available for just sort of initial conversations to explore kind of more of what your organisation wants to sort of look at. But thank you again, Sally. Really appreciate the time, and yeah, we will we'll look forward to doing this again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ed.
Thanks, Sally. Bye.